So what does his popularity tell us about America's mindset at the moment? Is it a country returning in itself? And is this idea of retrenchment a bigger phenomenon? Europe's becoming increasingly fractious and fractured amid a deepening row about refugees and migration. And of course, there's this summer's EU referendum here. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of an increasingly bellicose Vladimir Putin and a murderous so-called Islamic State. Are the ties that hold the West together weakening, and what will be the consequences if they are? To discuss this, I'm joined from Oxford by Professor Timothy Garton Ash, Professor of European Studies, from Yale by Timothy Snyder, historian of Central and Eastern Europe, and here in London by Anne Applebaum, the writer and historian. Good evening to you all. Timothy Snyder, first of all, what do you think is the Trumpian view of foreign policy?
Of course, it's hard to say because foreign policy requires some sense of your own nation's interests. There's been no consistent line on that. It also requires some sense of what your nation's capabilities are. He's said very little about that. But as far as one sort of takes a Rorschach test of his utterances, there are three main things. The first is antagonizing Latin America, destabilizing Mexico, building walls. The second is antagonizing the Muslim world, talking about killing families, talking about deporting people, talking about not letting refugees in. And the third is substituting our long and very important relationship with Europe and the European Union for a kind of personal, chummy relationship with President Putin of Russia.
And on those three, why is it, do you think, that they do strike a chord with some Americans, especially Americans that are not doing very well and see their money going out into foreign enterprise?
So from the point of view of the rest of the world, America seems like the champion of globalization. But from the point of view of a lot of Trump's electorate, America feels like the victim of globalization. And some of your reportage shows why. There are people who have a perfectly understandable sense that we're overextended and they're the ones who are taking the pain of globalization. And that makes sense. What Trump offers is a kind of life coaching, a kind of way of jumping over our own shadow where instead of having some kind of measured policy, he simply is going to assert that we're great and then improvise from there.
Well, Anne Applebaum, on that very point, you've just written a piece, a pretty apocalyptic piece for the Washington Post with what might happen in a Trump presidency, and it's a breakdown of the West.
Well, one of the possibilities that we now have in front of us, and it's of course not only the Trump presidency, but it's the EU referendum, it's the French elections next year, it's any one of a number of things that could happen over the next several months. One of the possibilities is a breakdown of what we call the West and what we call the Western Alliance. And it's a sort of thing we've relied on for 60 years. It's always been there. It's created this space of prosperity and stability. It's allowed people to get on with their lives. And we've stopped thinking it's important. We've stopped caring about it. And in order to maintain it, that requires not just an American president, but it requires European leaders as well, who are willing to invest in the boring and sometimes repetitive task of making deals and compromising and negotiations. And none of that seems to work anymore in an era when people want to hear loud exclamations and this kind of reality TV personalities and so on.
Timothy Garton Ash, how dangerous a moment do you think this is?
I wish I could be more cheerful than your other two guests, but I think that's right, and I think that we are in danger also of seeing the beginning of the end of the European Union. One would have to say that historically, the West as a geopolitical actor was held together by having a common enemy. Nazi Germany and the Axis powers, and then the Soviet Union through the Cold War. The problem now is that we have multiple common enemies. Islamist terrorism coming from the Middle East and homegrown in Europe, a very aggressive Russia under Vladimir Putin, and let's not forget a rising China which is building artificial islands with rocket launches in the South China Seas. And one of the things that has happened, which is a more constant long-term change, is that America is focusing increasingly, and perhaps rightly, on a rising China as its great power rival. And that leaves us in Europe to face up to the challenges of Islamist terrorism and particularly of Russia, which we're singularly failing to do.
Well, Timothy Snyder, no guarantee. I mean, Anne was talking about NATO and so forth, but no guarantee, for example, that trouble in Europe would bring America in under, for example, a Trump presidency, is there? There's no guarantee that he might not do this deal with this guy Putin that he seems to like and leave us standing.
As far as one can make out, Trump understands international politics in terms of personal relationships, and he has instinctual attractions to certain kinds of figures, which would be men of a certain age and men of certain kinds of political proclivities. So that puts him in a camp with people like Berlusconi or Putin. That Trump would care about European interests is hard to imagine, since it's not clear to me that he cares about U.S. interests. In order to understand how important Europe is, one has to first have a sense about what America's place in the world ought to be, aside from the kind of narcissistic cheerleading and life coaching that we've gotten so far.
Timothy Garton Ash, where have the seeds of this come from, do you think?
The seeds of this in the United States?
In the United States and indeed in Europe, this kind of retrenchment, this upset and unhappiness within Europe as well. You've talked about the fact that we might be nearing the end of the European Union, but where were the seeds of this sown?
I'm not sure that we can describe this as exactly the same phenomenon, because I think in the case of the United States, as Tim Snyder said, it's the discomfort of a vast so-called middle class who've seen their income stagnate or decline, and a sense of the relative decline of the United States as a great power, hence the motto, make America great again. I think in the case of Europe, people feel overwhelmed by a multitude of European crises, the Eurozone crisis, the migrant crisis, the refugee crisis, the rise of populist and xenophobic parties. And what is clear is that the United States is not going to ride to our rescue, even under, by the way, a President Hillary Clinton, which is in fact the most likely outcome, because a candidate Trump makes a President Clinton much more likely.
So, Anne Applebaum, you talked about the problems in Europe, but also you look at Hungary, you look at the rise of right-wing leaders again, particularly in the eastern area of Europe. Viktor Orban is just but one, and you think, where is the common connection in Europe? It seems to have disappeared so fast, perhaps because of the refugee crisis, the splits have shown, but it shows that there isn't actually common cause.
Well, there was a sense, until 2008 and 2009, there was a sense that Europe was a kind of island of prosperity and stability in the world, and that integrating with it...
And that democracy worked.
And that democracy worked, and integrating with it and growing with it was the best way forward. And that was so automatic that most people didn't think about alternatives. And I think actually it's since the time of the crash in 2008, the Eurozone crash in 2009, people began to question at that point whether, this is right for my country, is it going the right way? And that's had, I wouldn't actually say it's an East European problem, I would say it's a pan-European problem, and it's shown itself through flukes in particular places. But I mean, the rise of the right, the kind of, it's not even really right, isn't even the right word anymore, because Marine Le Pen's National Front has what we would call left-wing economics, but it has populist language. And the rise of similar parties in the Netherlands and in other parts of the world, other parts of Europe, are the same. So I think it's a growing problem across the continent.
Timothy Garton Ash, you wanted in there.
Yes, I just wanted to say also, as does the governing party in Poland, I think Anne Applebaum is exactly right. It's a mistake to see this as just an East European problem. It's a pan-European problem. And it also is to be observed that Vladimir Putin is extremely keen on Marine Le Pen and has reportedly helped to fund her party. Europe at the moment, in its disunity, is giving Putin's Russia many opportunities to divide and rule. And could I just add, this is therefore a particularly frivolous moment for Britain to be contemplating leaving the European Union. That is a prospect that fills the United States with horror and Vladimir Putin with delight.
Timothy Snyder, if the 20th century was America's century, that would not necessarily be the case in the 21st, do you think?
I think that's still wide open. What I'd say about the 20th century is this. The common trend that we see in the remarks of colleagues here is the rise of national populism, whether it is in Russia, Poland, Hungary, France, or the United States. And what national populism has in common is that authoritarian leaders can like each other, they can support each other morally, they can support each other financially, but what they cannot do is build common structures. And what the history of the 20th century tells us is that there was never a good moment when nations were alone. So the institutions that hold us together, whether it's the European Union or whether it's the transatlantic alliance, are much more important than we think, because Russia alone or France alone or Hungary alone or even America alone has no place to go. And if we've forgotten that, we should think again about those crucial decades of the 20th century, the 1920s and 1930s.
Well, finally, Anne Applebaum, if there is something to be optimistic about, what is it? Is there something that can hold us together?
I think the ideals of the West and the ideals of democracy are still things that people care about and will fight for. You know, in each of the countries you've mentioned where there is a rise of populism or there is a rise of authoritarianism, there has also been a pushback and there has been an argument. So it isn't as if it's disappeared. It's just being challenged for the first time in a much more severe way than we're used to.
Thank you all very much indeed.